So what are we doing tonight?
Yeah, we're talking about some imprecatory Psalms related stuff. You guys got the email, and I assume that you did the reading or some of the reading. And there were three topics I wanted to put on the table for tonight, and maybe get to one or two or three of them. And those topics were David and his relationship with personal vengeance and his attitude toward that, and his relationship to the Psalter as a whole. We already know that David wrote most of the imprecatory Psalms, a very high percentage of them, and so that's why we would consider the questions about what did he think about personal vengeance, and what is his relationship to the entire Psalter, and how are we to think of these Psalms of David or Psalms in general. I wanted to also talk about that idea of dashing children, against the stones from Psalm 137. I wanted to explore that a little bit more. I think you probably all read about that. There was a quote in the outline that if you haven't read it, we'll still visit it tonight if we get to it. And then the tenth thing on the outline was the relation of the imprecatory Psalms, or the imprecations that are in the Psalms, the relation of them as they appear in the prophets and in the law. And we might get to that tonight. We'll see. So regarding the thing on the first outline, so we're on page 2 of the outline, number 4, about David. And I know that you all know David and his life well. And so we'll go look at these passages, but I'm sure that these won't be the first time that you've seen them. Let's start with David's attitude when dealing with Saul, and we'll look at 1 Samuel 24 for that.
Those encounters were a reflection of a patient man.
A patient man.
David.
Yeah.
David.
yeah, and the secret of his patience was that he relied on the Lord, and realized that it's not his place. He's not the executioner. So let's just look at the whole chapter so that we get the context here. Don, can you start reading, and then
Sure.
Steve, and then Gary? We'll just read the whole chapter that way.
Yeah, where are we?
We're going to be in 1 Samuel 24. I think you're going to pick up reading in verse 8, and then Gary, if you could read 16 to the end.
1 Samuel 24.
And so Don, you have 1 through 7.
Okay. After Saul had returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to look for David and his men in the region of the rocks of the wild goats. Soon Saul came to the sheepfolds along the road where there was a cave, and he went in to relieve himself. And David and his men were hiding in the recesses of the cave. So David's men said to him, This is the day about which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do with him as you wish. Then David crept up secretly and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David's conscience was stricken because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. So he said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed. May I never lift my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. With these words, David restrained his men, and he did not let them rise up against Saul. Then Saul left the cave and went on his way.
We're picking up at verse 8. I'll finish this paragraph, which is verse 15, I guess. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there was no wrong or reason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? And after whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it, and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand.
From verse 16, when David finished saying this, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family." So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold.
So what do we learn about David from this?
Yeah.
Patient, respects the Lord's anointed, regardless of who he is or how he's being treated.
Yeah, if he wasn't going to strike Saul in those conditions when it looked like a setup to his men, he wasn't going to take it out on him any other time either, I guess.
And what was happening to David at this point? Or
He
what
had
was
been pursued. As he says there, that Saul was trying to chase him down to kill him.
Yeah, this had been going on for a while. And so David is being pursued without justification, for no cause. Saul is pursuing him, and Saul is trying to kill him. And Saul has turned, the army against David. David used to be the most popular man in the kingdom, but now he's been hounded out, and he's with 400 or 500 other people in the wilderness. So he's fallen quite a bit, but yet he has there's not even an inkling of the desire for revenge in his heart. I mean, he's so tender-hearted that verse 5 really jumps out. After he cut the corner off of Saul's robe, it says, Verse 5, and afterward David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And David thought to himself, this was wrong. Just even cutting the corner off of the robe was the wrong thing to do. It's disrespectful. It's kind of a trick. I should not lift my hand at all. And so his heart is not about, there's nothing in this situation that says that David has in his heart anything about personal revenge or that take the matters into his own hands or be the executioner here. Saul is clearly in the wrong, and Saul has clearly been in the wrong a lot. And the other thing I see about David, which is really interesting, is in verse 14. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm looking at the ESV, but there are no question marks in the ESV in verse 14. Are there any question marks in anybody's Bibles in verse 14?
Yes, after pursuing and after a dead dog.
Oh, after a dead dog and after a flea.
And a flea, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
No, I've got 4 of them against whom has the king of Israel come out. Who, they should have said, whom are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? I've got 4 question marks in there.
Right. So I misspoke. I actually have 2. I have exclamation marks after the last 2, after dead dog.
It is sort of a rhetorical.
Yeah, after a dead dog, after a flea. So apparently there's some disagreement on how to exactly punctuate that. But with the exclamation point there, it kind of underscores David's own attitude about himself, is that he is making the declaration. Who are you chasing? A dead dog. He's not saying a dead dog. He's saying a dead dog. I'm a dead dog. You're chasing a flea. I'm totally insignificant. But this this incident really, however whatever the punctuation is there in those 2 things, I think David's humility and reliance on the Lord and his pureness of his heart toward Saul, even though Saul is probably, of all of the difficulty that David faces in his life, this one is probably the most, one of the most difficult. This and Absalom turning against him. Because Saul is the Lord's anointed. Saul, yes, Mom, I see you're waving.
Yes, I was going to say this passage also underscores David's complete trust in God, because when he confronts Saul, he's putting his life in danger.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have to go to Saul, but he goes to him, and he's completely trusting God to take care of him. He's also trusting God for God's plan for him for his future, when he says, let God judge between us.
Right. And I think that trust is shown so much when he comes and he makes himself prostrate before Saul. And he comes down puts his arms out, and he's got nothing in his hands, no weapon, and he's on the ground in front of Saul. And
I thought Saul's reaction was very interesting, because he seems to change so much between hating David and respecting him. And was him saying, may the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king. And yet he goes out and chases him again, not soon after that. So it's he's a real changeling when it comes to his relationship to David.
Yeah, and I think his relationship with David is, a reflection of his confidence, his faith in the Lord. Because you remember how David was brought to his attention the second time was that he was having bouts with this evil spirit that was causing him to get angry about stuff, and then David would play music for him, and then eventually so you see this going back and forth of Saul the rational king who loves David to Saul the guy who wants to kill David. And it was a battle. It looks like a real battle with Saul and a demonic force. At least when I read it, that's what it looks like to me. Mm-hmm. And so the most interesting thing in this passage in regards to Saul, I think, is that he says, is that your voice, David?
Yeah, my son.
Yeah, but it's like he doesn't recognize David. It's like he's coming out of a stupor or something. Like he's looking at David and he's hearing him talk, and then he goes, is Is that David? So
Well, he
that,
was bipolar, for crying out loud.
yeah, perhaps, perhaps, but even a a bipolar, unstable king is to be respected. So so anyway, I think that this is a good illustration of David's attitude. And then there's a similar thing, but not with the Lord's anointed. Somebody could argue, well, this is the Lord's anointed, so David has a special attitude towards the Lord's anointed. But let's look at his incident with Shammai, or however you say his name, in 2 Samuel 16. So this is verses 5 through 14. And Nancy, could you read 5 through 8 and then Mom 9 through 14?
Sure. I think I'm going to call him Shimei.
Okay, that might be right.
Oh no, mine says Shimei curses David. Now when King David came to Bahurim, there was a man from the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of, I don't know, Gera?
Probably.
Coming from there. He came out cursing continuously as he came. And he threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David. And all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. Also, Shimei said thus when he cursed, come out, you bloodthirsty man, you rogue. The Lord has brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom, your son. So now you are caught in your own evil, because you are a bloodthirsty man.
Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. But the king said, what do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? David then said to Abishai and all his officials, my son, who is of my own flesh, is trying to take my life. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I am receiving today. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself.
Boy, does questions come to mind from these verses.
Yeah, I'm sure you're thinking of David's instructions to Solomon. And if you weren't, someone was probably going to bring that up, but let's postpone that for a little bit. So the context here is, David is now the Lord's anointed. He's the king, and
Saul's dead.
Saul's dead. And despite the accusations here of Shimei that David has the blood of Saul's family on his hands, it is true that David is a man of blood. And the Lord himself calls him that. But David is totally guiltless in the deaths of Saul and Jonathan. David.
That's what I don't understand. Why does Shimei say these things? He must know it's not true.
Well, he may not know that, or he may. I don't know how to explain it except to say, look at some of the protesters that's been going on. If you're paying any more attention to the protesters, it's either they don't know history or they're making stuff up in a lot of cases. And I think they just don't know history. I think they've just got a distorted view. And so, but, David is completely innocent of these charges, yet he doesn't say one word in his defense, and he shuts down his mighty men who want to go and protect his honor. And he basically says to them, this may be the Lord's will. The Lord, Shimei is saying he's speaking for the Lord. And
And
the
he doesn't
Lord,
seem to be suggesting the possibility. David seems to be saying that this is fact.
yeah, he says both of them. You know, he says, if the Lord has sent him, then what can we say against it? And then he says, the Lord has sent him after that. Not sure how to interpret that second one, you know, but in either case, you know, the person who's ridiculing David and attacking David has no grounds. Again, he's got no grounds. And this isn't the only stress that David is facing this day, right? He's just been driven out of his house, out of Jerusalem, off the throne by his son, and he's leaving Jerusalem, and he's just got a small group of his loyal counselors and family with him, and so he's in not a good place, not an enviable place, and then this happens, and his attitude is exactly the same as what it was with Saul. It was basically, look, it's hands off. It's not up to me. You know, doesn't even cross his mind really to do anything to Shimei except to endure it. And which is why I think that's why at the end of the narrative here, it says that everybody with him, the king and everybody with him, arrived at their destination exhausted. Because the picture that's printed is that every step of the way, this guy's kicking dirt at him and throwing rocks at him and cursing at him. Excuse me. So I think the picture we get from the biblical record about David and his relationship with personal vengeance is that he didn't have a vengeful heart. That his heart was to, you know, endure what he believed the Lord had put in his path, that he's going to walk through the valley of the shadow of death and not fear any evil, and that he is leaving it to the Lord to either reward, as in this case, he says, maybe the Lord will reward me, you know, for this later, for the way I'm acting today. And of course, the opposite side of that is maybe the Lord will punish the one who is cursing wrongfully. So I think actually the later on, as you probably all know, when David is about to die and he's passing the kingdom over to Solomon, he tells Solomon to deal with 3 different people, and one of them is Shimei. And he says, I think what he said about Shimei is what he said about all of them: don't let their, you know, gray hairs go down to death in peace. So Solomon says to Shimei, you know, my father, you know, was gracious to you, etc., but if you go outside of the city or out past this boundary, you know, it's your life is forfeit. And so Shimei does that like 2.5 years later, 3 years later, he passes the border. Solomon hears about it and has him executed. And so the question comes up, well, wasn't that vengeance?
Justice.
No, I think it is justice. And I think what David realizes is that at the end of his life, none of the evil prophecies that Shimei gave came true. And this guy's a false prophet. He's out there speaking in the name of the Lord, and he's going to allow his son, who is wise, to create a situation where the false prophet gets to be judged or justice is taken. So
and this is a huge example of why why the Lord said David is a man after his own heart, because of the patience and the attitude that David had toward his enemies.
Right. So it's important to think about this when we read the Imprecatory Psalms, because as I've said, most of them are written by David. And so when we read the Imprecatory Psalms, you know, it's not an instance of something out of character. You know, those Psalms have to be understood as have been written by the same person that acted these ways in these situations and was consistent like this. So however they strike us, they're not about personal vengeance, because there's nothing about personal vengeance that could be associated with David. So I think
It reminds me of Christ, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say something
You
about
too?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thinking the same thing, because weren't we talking about how the Psalms were, well, obviously the whole Bible is written by God, it's all inspired by him, but didn't we talk about how Jesus wrote the Psalms, or they could be coming from his point of view?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
can you talk again about how that connects with David's point of view? And I'm a little bit confused about that.
Sure. Yeah. So this is the way I understand it, and there's probably a better way to understand it and a better way to explain it, and I'm still working through these things, but there are clearly Psalms where the speaker is Jesus, not just because David couldn't have said that like Psalm 22, but because of the way Jesus or the New Testament writers use the Psalm and apply it to Jesus, or Jesus quotes it in such a way as he's quoting it as if he's the speaker. And so I think with those Psalms, we can say that the relationship between David being the author, the human author, and Jesus being the speaker is this, that David is God's anointed on God's throne. And these Psalms that he writes are either about enemies that he's faced and things that he had to endure, or and so this would be on his way, maybe on his way to the throne, or troubles he had with Saul and things like that. And then about justice and righteousness of his kingdom. And so David, as God's anointed, is speaking for God's people, and he's also speaking for himself. But David is a type and a shadow. He's a picture of Jesus, who is God's anointed, who is on the throne, who speaks for God's people and for himself. So I think that there's at least a parallel between what David writes and what Jesus experiences and says. I think the life of David is a pattern that is repeated again in the life of Jesus. And that, because that's the way God communicates in his word. I'm sure you've all noticed that God has patterns that he just does over and over, and they culminate in Christ. They all point forward to Christ. So Nancy, I guess the short answer is, because David is not speaking I don't believe he's speaking as an individual. I believe he's speaking as God's anointed. And sometimes he's speaking as the anointed in struggle, or as the anointed on the throne. And sometimes he's speaking as the representative of God's people. And so obviously the first two categories would apply directly to Jesus, and then the other one, speaking for God's people, would apply to Jesus as mediator. So that's how I would understand it. Does that make some sense?
It helps, and I think I'll go back and listen to the recording and hear it one more time. So thank you so much.
Yeah, there's a book I can recommend called it's called The War Psalms, or The War Songs. I think it's Psalms of the Prince of Peace, and the author is a guy named Adams, Adams. War Psalms of the Prince of Peace.
War Psalms
of the Prince of Peace.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll send you a link. I'll send you guys a link to that on Amazon. You can't get it for free, but it's only like $12, I think.
And the author's name again, please?
The last name is Adams.
Oh, that was tough. I couldn't remember that.
Yeah, it's unfamiliar names like that are so hard. Yeah, I'll send that link to you guys today. He does a really good job, I think, representing that view that I just articulated, and also it's a view that goes all the way back to the early church fathers. It was consistently their view as well. So it's not a new thing to think of it like that. It's actually, I think in our day and age, we've kind of got away from some of the ways that have been consistently the way that people would read the Bible, Christians would read the Bible. And I think that because of the Enlightenment and other things, we need to relearn some stuff that probably got forgotten. So that's one of the things. And that question that you asked is also related to what is David's relationship to the entire Psalter. So we'll get to that in just a bit here. So I wanted to show three examples from the imprecatory Psalms themselves where the author expresses the author who is David, expresses the same sentiments as we see in these instances here. So if you look at Psalm 7, but the reason that the Psalms, or the incident in David's life, sounds like something that our Lord endured, persecution from ungodly people for no reason, that was relentless and they wanted to kill him. And he took it as a sheep going to the slaughter, quiet, didn't rebuke, didn't correct. The reason that David's life looks like Jesus's life is because David is a picture, of Jesus. So that's why we would have that. Psalm 7, I'll go ahead and read it. Here's a hard word. Shagaion. Okay, that's a musical term probably, yeah.
Well, I looked it up, and it says that it can mean someone who's wandering, who's sort of tipsy from drink.
Oh.
Or just someone who's kind of wandering.
And was that the Hebrew meaning, or was that the Hebrew word? Or it occurs to me this word could be like just, there could be a Gaelic word that looks like that.
A footnote in my Bible says it's probably a literary or musical term.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's kind of like, it's either that or something else.
Yeah, it's something or something else. Yeah.
Sort of like a sax bridge in the middle of a song. Tenor sax takes over and does a solo, then you go back to the lyrics.
Yeah, so we would just have to find the right interlude for that in here, right? So a musical term of David, which he sang to the Lord concerning the words of Cush, a Benjaminite. O Lord my God, in you do I take refuge. Save me from all my pursuers and deliver me, lest like a lion they tear my soul apart, rending it in pieces with none to deliver. O Lord my God, if I have done this, if there is wrong in my hands, if I have repaid my friend with evil, or plundered my enemy without cause, let the enemy pursue my soul and overtake it, and let him trample my life to the ground and lay my glory in the dust. Arise, O Lord, in your anger, lift yourself up against the fury of my enemies. Awake for me, you have appointed a judgment. Let the assembly of the peoples be gathered about you, over it return on high. The Lord judges the peoples. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness, and according to the integrity that is in me. O let the evil of the wicked come to an end, and may you establish the righteous, you who test the minds and hearts, O righteous God. My shield is with God, who saves the upright in heart. God is a righteous judge, and a God who feels indignation every day. If a man does not repent, God will whet his sword. He has bent and readied his bow. He has prepared for him his deadly weapons, making his arrows fiery shafts. Behold, the wicked man conceives evil and is pregnant with mischief and gives birth to lies. He makes a pit, digging it out, and falls into the hole that he has made. His mischief returns upon his own head, and on his own skull his violence descends. I will give to the Lord the thanks due to his righteousness, and I will sing praise to the Lord, to the name of the Lord, the Most High. So a couple of...
Are you reading from the ESV or the NIV?
Oh, that was the ESV. Yeah, ESV. So David is putting the problem and the solution to the problem in the Lord's hands. David says what his part is to make sure that he's not guilty before the Lord, right? He says that in verse 3, 4, and 5. He says, look, if I've done these things, then, they're pursuing me. They're saying I did these things. If I did them, go ahead and let them get me, because that would be just. So his part is to say to the Lord, or to examine his own heart and say, my heart is clean. I haven't done these things. I am willing to submit to your judgment if I have done these things. I'm asking for you to judge them and to stop them, but I'm not taking it into my own hands. My job here, my only place here, is to praise you and to trust you. And that's what he says at the end, after saying all the things that will happen to the wicked. At the very end, he says, I will give to the Lord the thanks that is due to his righteousness. So, but you notice in the middle there, at least 3 through 5, 3, 4, and 5, that David expresses that the expression here is that the prayer is about justice, because he says to the Lord, they're behaving badly, bring it back on their own heads, and if I've behaved badly, bring it back on my head. And so
Either way, justice.
Right. And then,
And
but
he cared so,
I'm sorry?
yeah. Oh, I just was saying he cared so much about what the Lord thought. I mean,
Yeah.
his eyes were always on the Lord. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is, because his life was not easy, and these problems he talks about were not minor. And
Mm-hmm.
and I get upset when my computer's slow. And and David had way bigger problems than that, and his attitude was basically, if it's the Lord's will that I go through this, then I'll go through it. I know it's not the Lord's will for me to take it into my own hands and try to fix it. And so I'm just going to praise the Lord and keep walking on this path. And
Mm-hmm.
and that's to be, our attitude. And of course, that was Jesus' attitude, right? For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. He knew it was coming, and he said, I'm just going to go through this. This is my Father's will. And so, it's almost, it's a shaming thing to say, I get upset when the computer's slow, but because that's nothing.
Reality.
Yeah, that's just nothing, though. It's just really, is that really the level of my confidence? Shouldn't I just say, oh Lord, if you will that the computer's slow, I'm just going to deal with it. Thank you.
If you willed it.
Well, that you willed it. Obviously, it's happening, and nothing happens outside of your will. So, that was David's view. Yes, Mom.
So I see something in this discussion of David and his character that I haven't seen before. And in that he was totally God-centered, not self-centered. And he's not egotistical at all. It isn't all about him. He doesn't see himself as being better than other people, or that he is owed anything. And that relates to the fact that he was not vengeful, because vengeance comes to an egotistical person who thinks they have been wronged.
Yeah. Yeah. Who thinks that? I guess you could modify that to say, who thinks that the wrong done to them is the most supreme of all the wrongs. In other words, I think David knew that the behavior toward him was wrong, and so David had been wronged. But the actual wrong was to God's honor. Just like when David said, "Every sin is a sin against you, God." I think the dishonor to God's anointed when Shimei is throwing rocks at David is a dishonoring of God. And David knows that God will not let that go unanswered. God will either bring repentance to Shimei or God will judge. But David, he's the minor. His hurt is he's the minor player in this. He's not the one who's been offended the most. So I think there's that too. The offense done to God's glory and his honor is so much greater than the offense done to, like when the Jewish people kill the prophets. So the sin that God says they're guilty of is not that they killed the prophets, but that they rejected him. Did you
Mhm.
kill the prophets? You rejected me. And now, and so it's the honor of the Lord that is paramount. And so I think that that's also comes into play there, where you know that, like you said, Mom, David is not at all self-centered. He is theocentric. He is God-centered, and he is consistently like this. And that would mean in all of his thinking, then God is elevated. God is elevated above David in every circumstance. And so even when David is being driven out by Absalom, his thought is not for himself. His thought is maybe the Lord is speaking through him. Let's listen, you know.
Mhm.
And it also was for the people in Jerusalem.
Yeah. Go ahead, Deborah.
You know, I was just so reminded of how I was as a young boy, 14 or 15, and he went to slay Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
He had no care for himself. He was very humble, had no care for himself. He was only interested in the honor of God. So amazing.
Yeah, I think that's a defining characteristic of somebody who, I think the more mature we become in the faith, it's like what John the Baptist said, right? He must increase, I must decrease.
Mhm.
I think that's it. As you become more and more mature in the faith, you don't really even think about your needs first anymore. You're thinking about, what does God require? What does God want? What would make my Heavenly Father pleased? And I'm so far away from that. I need the Lord to capture my heart. And because I see David and I see Jesus, and I say that's exactly, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So let's look at Psalm 35. We'll just look at these. Did you guys read these before class? These Psalms?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You don't mind if we look at them again? So good.
All right.
All right. So we got Psalm 35. This one's even a little more rough than Psalm 7. Let's see. Who hasn't read? Stephanie hasn't read. And
Deborah.
that's
Deborah?
it.
Read, Deborah?
Yeah, Deborah.
No, I
Okay.
haven't read it.
Okay, so Stephanie, can you do 1 through 8, and then Deborah 9 through 14, and then
Sure.
I'll do some after that, and then we'll see what happens.
Okay. Psalm 35
Yes.
of David. Okay. Contend, O Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take hold of shield and buckler and rise for my help. Draw the spear and javelin against my pursuers. Say to my soul, I am your salvation. Let them be put to shame and dishonor who seek after my life. Let them be turned back and disappointed who devise evil against me. Let them be like chaff before the wind, with the angel of the Lord driving them away. Let their way be dark and slippery, with the angel of the Lord pursuing them. For without cause they hid their net for me. Without cause they dug a pit for my life. Let destruction come upon him, and he does not know it. And let the net that he hid ensnare him. Let him fall into it to his destruction.
Then my soul will rejoice in the Lord and delight in his salvation. My whole being will exclaim, who is like you, Lord? You rescue the poor from those too strong for them, the poor and needy from those who rob them. Ruthless witnesses come forward. They question me on things I know nothing about. They repay me evil for good and leave me like one bereaved. Yet when they were ill, I put on sackcloth and humbled myself with fasting. When my prayers returned to me unanswered, I went about mourning, as though for my friend or brother I bowed my head in grief, as though weeping for my mother That's through 14.
Yeah, thank you. But at my stumbling they rejoiced and gathered. They gathered together against me. Wretches whom I did not know tore at me without ceasing. Like profane mockers at a feast, they gnash at me with their teeth. How long, O Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from their destruction, my precious life from the lions. I will thank you in the great congregation, in the mighty throng I will praise you. Let not those rejoice over me who are wrongfully my foes, and let not those wink the eye who hate me without cause. For they do not speak peace, but against those who are quiet in the land they devise words of deceit. They open wide their mouths against me. They say, Aha, aha, our eyes have seen it. You have seen, O Lord, be not silent. O Lord, be not far from me. Awake and rouse yourself for my vindication, for my cause, my God and my Lord. Vindicate me, O Lord my God, according to your righteousness, and let them not rejoice over me. Let them not say in their hearts, Aha, our heart's desire. Let them not say, We have swallowed him up. Let them be put to shame and disappointed altogether who rejoice at my calamity. Let them be clothed with shame and dishonor who magnify themselves against me. Let those who delight in my righteousness shout for joy and be glad and say evermore, Great is the Lord, who delights in the welfare of his servant. Then my tongue shall tell of your righteousness and of your praise all the day long. Okay, so this psalm has a little bit more bite to it than Psalm 7 did. Psalm 7 was kind of third person. This is what happens to the wicked. But this one has, let them be shamed and dishonored. Let them turn back and be disappointed. Let them be like chaff before the wind, etc. But again, even here, in the part that Deborah read, even though there's verse 11, malicious witnesses rising up against him, and they're repaying him evil for good, he says in verse 13, But I, when they were sick, I wore sackcloth. I afflicted myself with fasting. I prayed with my head bowed down my chest, and I went about as though I grieved for my friend or my brother, as one who laments his mother. I bowed down in mourning. So David's attitude here is, even when they were treating me badly, I still prayed for them.
Yeah.
And I felt about them as if they were my family, my close friend. And I mourned for them that they were ill. And so his heart is, was for their good. But the prayer here is, since they're apparently not repenting and they're not changing, Lord, so bring back upon them what they deserve. And he says, one of the things that shocks people in the Imprecatory Psalms is that in verse 9, so we'll back up, verse 8, let destruction come upon him when he does not know it, and let the net that he hid ensnare him. Let him fall into it, to his destruction. Then the part that people get bothered by. Then my soul will rejoice in the Lord, exulting in his salvation. All my bones will say, O Lord, who is like you, delivering the poor from him who is too strong for him, the poor and the needy from him who robs him. So does that bother anybody that David would say that?
Just asking for justice.
Yeah.
What is he rejoicing in?
That the Lord's name has been justified and that the wicked are being punished or would be punished.
Right. So this is really interesting because in the same psalm, if you go over to, let's see, verse 26.
Psalm 26?
No, verse 26. Verse 26. Let them be put to shame and disappointed altogether who rejoice at my calamity. Now, does that strike anybody as inconsistent with verse 9? What's the difference between verses 9 and 10 and verse 26?
Whether or not the calamity was deserved.
Whether or not the calamity was deserved is one thing. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think, and there's one more thing, and I think it's already been brought up. Is he rejoicing in the downfall of those who persecute him, or is he rejoicing in something else? In verses 9 and 10.
My version says, rejoice in his salvation.
Right. And verse 10 says, all my bones shall say, in other words, everything about me, O Lord, who is like you, delivering the poor. So it's rejoicing in God's salvation, in God's deliverance. So it's a rejoicing in the activity of God. This is not rejoicing in the downfall of anybody. The downfall of somebody is a consequence, or is in the display of God's justice and holiness, the wicked fall. But it is the display of God's holiness and justice that brings the saints rejoicing, right?
Same for both ways.
Yeah. So in verse 26, when David says, let them be disappointed and frustrated, those who rejoice over my calamity, he's not in the group of people that rejoice over calamity.
Mm.
He rejoices over the Lord and the Lord's display of his glory. And so again, even right here, it's God-centered thinking. And so you see again, David's heart for those who attacked him without cause, malicious witnesses. Does this remind you of anybody? Malicious witnesses rise up against me. They're asking me questions I don't have any answer for. I don't know what they're talking about. Yeah. Persecuted without cause. They gnash their teeth at me. This is all crucifixion language, trial language. And did Jesus pray for his enemies? Did he not weep over Jerusalem that had rejected him and killed the prophets? So it's the same attitude, it's the same exact picture. But still there is a desire is for God's glory. Yeah.
And I was thinking we are called to do that also. Heap coals of love on people. I remember that. That's not quite the right way to say it, but we are called to forgive and to forget and to be kind to our enemies.
Yeah. There's a TV show from the 80s, I think. I'm not sure where it's from, but has anybody seen that show? It's from England, called Pie in the Sky. It's about a retired policeman who's got a restaurant. Anyway, it's not important except that the character, the retired policeman, there's people that are continually in the show, their characters take advantage of his character, and they say snide remarks about him, and they do all kinds of things, and he never has a bad thing to say about them, and he never retaliates. And it's just really interesting to watch. That's just a part of his character. It's not part of the plot line, but very interesting. I think that's the way God's people are supposed to be. Just whatever you say, fine. Yeah. So let's look at Psalm 109. It's the last example here. And let's see. So this is at the very beginning. I'll read maybe the first 9 or 10 verses. To the choir master, a psalm of David. Be not silent, O God of my praise. For wicked and deceitful mouths are opened against me, speaking against me with lying tongues. They encircle me with words of hate and attack me without cause. In return for my love, they accuse me, but I give myself to prayer. So they reward me evil for good and hatred for my love. Appoint a wicked man against him. Let an accuser stand at his right hand. When he is tried, let him come forth guilty. Let his prayer be counted sin. May his days be few. May another take his office. May his children be fatherless, and his wife a widow. May his children wander about and beg, seeking food far from the ruins they inhabit. Yeah, we'll go on and read the whole thing. May the creditor seize all that he has. May strangers plunder the fruits of his toil. Let there be none to extend kindness to him, nor any to pity his fatherless children. May his posterity be cut off. May his name be blotted out in the second generation. May the iniquity of his fathers be remembered before the Lord, and let not the sin of his mother be blotted out. Let them be before the Lord continually, that he may cut off the memory of them from the earth. For he did not remember to show kindness, but pursued the poor and the needy, and the brokenhearted, to put them to death. He loved to curse, let curses come upon him. He did not delight in blessing, may it be far from him. He clothed himself with cursing as his coat. May it soak into his body like water, like oil into his bones. May it be like a garment that he wraps around him, like a belt that he puts on every day. May this be the reward of my accusers from the Lord, of those who speak evil against my life. But you, O God, my Lord, deal on my behalf for your name's sake, because your steadfast love is good. Deliver me. For I am poor and needy, and my heart is stricken within me. I am gone like a shadow at evening. I am shaken off like a locust. My knees are weak through fasting. My body has become gaunt with no fat. I am an object of scorn to my accusers. When they see me, they wag their heads. Help me, O Lord my God. Save me according to your steadfast love. Let them know that this is your hand. You, O Lord, have done it. Let them curse, but you will bless. They arise and are put to shame, but your servant will be glad. May my accusers be clothed with dishonor. May they be wrapped in their own shame as in a cloak. With my mouth I will give great thanks to the Lord. I will praise him in the midst of the throng, for he stands at the right hand of the needy one, to save him from those who condemn his soul to death. So the same pattern that we saw before, I think, that they hate him and attack him without cause. He is poor and needy and defenseless, and so he cries out to the Lord. But not only that, he had a heart to love them. In verse 4, he's praying for them, he loves them, and in return for his love of them, they treat him evilly, they falsely accuse him, they put him into some dire straits, and they wag their tongues at him, which is to mock him. This is again all trial and crucifixion pictures. This has a lot of affinity with Psalm 22 about the crucifixion. So none of this is personal vengeance. This is all relying on the Lord and saying, my heart, I have done right. Go ahead, Don.
I found the second part of verse 14 unusual, I guess I would say.
Yeah. So what was unusual for you?
Well, it says, and do not let his mother's sin be blotted out. And it seems like it's rare that we hear a mother's sin brought up in any context, outside of like wicked queens or something, king's wives. To me, this was very unusual to see.
Yeah, a curse on the mother. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that doesn't happen a whole lot. I think it's related to the wish that the prayer that the entire family, the family line is wiped out. And so, which is something that we see quite often, actually, in the Old Testament judgments on people.
Yeah, Lee and I are reading book of Joshua. We just read chapters 9 and 10.
Okay, so you're
rough.
Was that AI?
That was after AI.
Yeah.
It was, the 5 kings that all got together against him.
Right.
Against them, I should say. But they went into this town and destroyed everyone, men, women, children, and no survivors. And then they went to the next town, the same thing, and the next town, the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and of course in the conquest, the reason for that is so that the Israelites wouldn't intermarry and start, I see your hand, Nancy, and wouldn't start worshiping the false gods, which of course is what they started doing. Nancy.
So looking at Psalm 109 again,
Mm-hmm.
how I'm a little confused. How is it not him asking for vengeance from God on, for him personally? For what's
So you're thinking about like verse 21, deal on my behalf for your name's sake. That.
Yeah, that was a good example. And then how about verse 20? Let this be the Lord's reward to my accusers.
Yeah, of those who speak evil against my life. Yeah, so I think that there are maybe more than one way that can be looked at, and I think I'm probably looking at it one way. So the way I'm looking at it is this: that since I already know David, and I know it's not personal vengeance, then I think then the only other option then is to say, this is the particular sin, Lord, that I want to bring to your attention. And the particular sin is the way they've treated me. I am an example of the poor and the needy who are being downtrodden, by people, by these people and people like this. Kind of like in Psalm 41, when Jesus, on the lips of Jesus, where he says, my close friend betrayed me, and then he dies, and then he says, raise me up so that I can judge him, so I can pay him back. The example of the sin of Judas is also in the group of people who are, taking advantage of the weak and the poor, and accusing them falsely and all kinds of things like that. So the way I understand it, Nancy, is that since I already know the context of David and David's life and his attitude, and because I already see in the other places and in this one that he's has a heart for his enemies and wants himself to be judged by the same standard if he's committed the same things, that also in this Psalm 109, the idea of the poor and the needy as a group comes up at least twice, and I think 3 or 4 times, where David says they've risen up against the poor and the needy. And so I think that he's not saying, me as an individual, you need to take care of me, but me as a member of this class, and here's the example that's close to home of the way they're mistreating and sinning against you. And that's because of the covenant. God's requirement in the covenant is, of course, to take care of the poor and the needy, and the widow and the orphan and all of that. And so when you mistreat them, you are defiling the covenant and all of everything that goes along with that. So I think that's how I look at it. Does that?
So he is asking for vengeance from God, for God to take vengeance, but not for him personally, but for the whole.
Yeah, the sins against the whole, the whole group of sins. Yeah, well, whenever you're asking God, obviously when you're praying that God would be just, you are asking him to take vengeance. And but since David is praying here as a representative of this group of people who have been sinned against, he's a mediator. He's doing the role of Christ, the mediator. So I think that's what's going on there.
Okay.
Yes, Mom.
Think of all the Psalms we've discussed, this one most clearly to me sounds like this is Jesus talking.
Mm.
And he's saying to the Father to glorify him for the work he's done and to bring judgment on those who have rejected him, which this judgment sounds a lot like what happened in 70 AD when families were destroyed and memories were blotted out and
Yeah.
a bunch of other stuff, you know.
Yeah, it does sound like that. It does sound like that. So anyway, I think the things that we've talked about are good subjects to talk about, good things to think about when we're reading these Psalms and thinking about them. That since most of them come from the pen of David, then we can assume rightly, I think, that there's no personal revenge thought there, and that David is often writing as a representative of a group. Sometimes he's writing as the king, you know, the anointed king, and sometimes he's the anointed representing a particular group. And that all of these are find their greatest expression of the persecuted, of the man who is persecuted, the righteous man who's persecuted, who didn't do anything wrong, and he was wrongfully accused and hounded, and malicious witnesses, and wanted his death, that this is Christ. And it's all about Christ. And so what it tells us is God is concerned for, Christ is concerned for justice. And Christ, through here, we're also instructed that Christ prayed for, and David prayed for his enemies, and we are to do that also. And that, and we are not to leave any vengeance. We're not to take vengeance. We are certainly to expect that the Lord would glorify himself by being just. He's going to do that. So, and you know, we haven't really shown it yet, but most of these things that are prayed are just repetition of covenant curses. You know, we look at the covenant curses, and you might recognize some of them, but they're just covenant curse language being applied. And so it is just a case, really, of the psalmist saying to God, or asking God, you know, how long? Isn't this one of those situations where you would do something? So this is what, you know, do this type of thing. So anyway, I found it really interesting that within even the worstest, I guess that's the word, worstest.
The most worstest.
The most worstest.
Double
Most worst.
Yeah. You know, Psalm 69 and Psalm 109. So Psalm 109 we read it today. So it's 35, 69, and 109. Those are the three most worstest. And when we look at those, what we see is, you know, innocent sufferer, maliciously accused, wrongfully hounded, with asking for God. And it says he's going to rejoice when God displays his glory. So I think that we can take those, if we look at the worst ones and we say, well, that's what's going on there. I think that we can assume that that's also going on in all the other ones, that there's no personal vengeance. So I wanted to talk a little bit. What time is it? It is 8:19. So I got just a very short time. Let me see if I can find what I'm looking for. I had a PowerPoint. It's very exciting when you get to see a PowerPoint. I wanted to talk about the relationship between David and the Psalter. So by the Psalter, I mean all of the Psalms, 150 Psalms. So David wrote close to 80 Psalms. So it's just over half. And of the imprecatory Psalms, David wrote, you know, however you count them, he wrote close to 75%, 80% of the imprecatory Psalms. Some authors say David wrote all the imprecatory Psalms, but they have a shorter list of imprecatory Psalms. But what is the relationship of David to the Psalter? That's an important question, because if the Psalms are somehow thought of as, you know, all of them associated with the name of David, then even the imprecatory Psalms that were not written by David can be understood as still representative of God's anointed speaking, or being about God's people and God's anointed. So I wanted to just show you a couple of Bible translations from in English from the past couple hundred years, 300-400 years, that where the Psalms are translated and called the Psalms of David, whereas of course the translators all knew that David didn't write them all. So let me see if I can share my screen, and there it is. So you guys can all see that? Is that a good size? So like okay. So title pages of the Psalms in English printings. And of course, this is just a select few. So there we have, you can see that it says the Psalms of David in meter, translated and diligently compared with the original text, former translations, printed in Edinburgh in 1812. So that's Psalms of David. And then the really cool feature, did you see that? That was awesome. The Psalms of David with the Ten Commandments, the Creed, and the Lord's Prayer in meter, also with the Catechism, Confession of Faith, and Liturgy, printed in New York in 1767. Sorry, it looks like this must be really small on your screens. I wonder if I make it bigger, if it looks better. Does it look better to you if I do that?
I could even read Protestant.
All right.
It's good.
All right.
The gospel. There we go.
So this one's cool. You guys know who Matthew Henry is, I think. So this particular version of the Psalms of David, which was printed and approved by the Church of Scotland, has annotations of the Reverend Mr. Matthew Henry printed in it. So his commentary on the Psalms are printed in here, 1767. Here's the Book of Common.
But where do you see the date? I don't.
Oh, let's see. Can I back up? Oops, I can't back up.
Or it's over on.
Numerals?
Yeah, let me back it up. So on this one, the date is the very last bottom here, MDCCLXV11
Oh, okay. Yeah.
VII. And so I printed it over here on the side, 1767.
Oh, got it.
Is that
Okay.
too small?
So, did you figure that out, Chuck, or you looked that up? And
No, I figured that out. I know how to convert those. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that was right. Well, not right before, but fairly close to the Revolutionary War, 1767. Gosh.
Yeah, very close. Very
Oh
close.
my goodness.
So here's a 1760 printing of the Book of Common Prayer. You can see 2/3 of the way down, it says, together with the Psalter or Psalms of David. So synonymous name, 1760. This book is from 2016. This is published by a Jewish publication house. You can see the title is The Psalms of King David, Insights and Inspirations. I looked at the contents, and even though it does not contain all 150 Psalms, it contains about half of the Psalms that they've listed are not written by David. So they're using the title to refer to any of the Psalms. Here's another one. This is the entire Psalter, translated in 1982, Psalms of David. This is my favorite title. This is 1662. David's Harp Strung and Tuned, or an easy analysis of the whole book of Psalms.
EAFIE, that says EP?
Where are you? Oh yeah, this one, yeah.
Right.
Right. So the thing that looks like an F is actually an S. So if you had in the middle of a word, so you see this under here where it says meditation or prayer. At the end of every psalm. See that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also thought that one of the kings could not say S, so they changed everything to F. Or is that not?
I hadn't heard that. That might be true, but I haven't heard that.
In German, it's written that way.
Is
in
it?
the German language, an S is written as we would write an F.
Yeah.
Oh.
And
So
that Indian woman, Pocahontas.
Pocahontas?
Yeah. The font.
Yeah, the font. Oops, I went the wrong way again. Back this way. Back this way.
He's this John Calvin guy.
Yeah, I heard nobody ever heard of him. All right, so we're back over here. So you said something about the font, Steve?
Well, on the what appears to be the letter F on easy, E-A, what appears to be an F-I-E, that F, which is an S, that particular font is different than the one used in the word psalm later on the
Right,
page.
because it's italicized. But the thing that's interesting is there's a word with an F in it. So if you look at framed, so you see it says meditation or prayer, and then the line underneath that, you see framed. So I don't know if you can see it, but there's the cross on the psalm. You know, the crossing line goes on the psalm, on the F in framed, goes all the way across, just like the way we would write a lowercase f. But in psalm or in easy, there's just a kind of a tick on the left side, but not the right. It's actually a different character on the keyboard. So
well, this applies. No, this is not only when it's the first letter, because it says at the end of every psalm framed for the motif part.
For the most part. That's most part.
Out of the words of the psalm and fitted for several occasions with an S at the end.
Right. Yeah, and I think actually if there's two S's in a row, the second one is what we would call an S. So it's interesting. You can go on Google and look up old books and read them, and you get used to it pretty easily. It's pretty cool. So this is 2019, last year, Psalms of David. So it's kind of a pretty binding there. This is John Calvin's commentary. He wrote this in the 16th century. This one was published in 1860, commentary on the Psalms of David. This is the King James Bible from 1631, the Psalms of King David. This is another King James Bible from 1668, the Psalms of King David paraphrased.
There's that S again.
Oh, there's that F. Well, that one looks like an F. It doesn't have that sort of.
It doesn't have the hanging down thing on the bottom.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah, and it also doesn't have the cross. There's no cross on the F.
Oh.
Like you would have on a T or a regular.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then this one. So you might recognize some of these people here. So the Psalms of David, imitated in the language of the New Testament and applied to the Christian state and worship by Isaac Watts, 13th edition. Then he's quoting Luke and Hebrews. And then it's printed in Philadelphia, reprinted and sold by B. Franklin.
Oh.
And I like the address. I like the address for his printing at the new printing office, which is near the market, 1740.
That's cool.
Didn't even have a zip code.
B. Franklin at the new printing office. Oh my gosh.
Pretty cool.
1740. So, oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah. So.
Oh, it's pretty at the new cover.
So here we go. So that was my little presentation. Did you like the way they kind of rotated? That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So that's PowerPoint.
Nice
Neat.
touch.
Neat. So what I wanted to show you was that it was very typical to when you said the Psalms of David, you weren't just talking about a select group of Psalms. You were actually, that was the title that has been consistent in the church, not only the Christian church, but in the Jewish understanding of the Psalms. They call them the Psalms of David as well. So this is, there's a theological reason for that. It's not because David wrote more than half of them. It's because David is speaking. He's the sweet psalmist of Israel who is speaking as God's anointed king. And so he's speaking with the voice of the Messiah, the anointed king, for God's people as their mediator. And all of the Psalms, no matter who wrote them, are viewed as connected to David in this messianic way. And so that should help us in our reading of them also when we read them. So that's that I found fascinating. And then it's 8:30, so we're near the end of our time today. So we almost got through the first subject, almost. We'll do Hebrews 4:7 next week, and then continue on that.